In the 24th chapter of Luke's Gospel, Jesus has risen from the dead, and he's walking on the road to Emmaus with two disciples who do not recognize him. They're brokenhearted over Jesus' death, and they tell this to the mysterious stranger who's walking with them. Jesus, in return, tells them that all of this was a part of God's plan. And in verse 27, we read, "Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself." Jesus goes through the Old Testament with these two disciples, and he shows them how all of it testifies to him. Once you understand the gospel, you find that the whole Old Testament points to Jesus, even though his name is never once mentioned. It's like one of those movies like The Sixth Sense or The Usual Suspects, where something's revealed at the end of the story that changes the meaning of everything that has come before. I want to use this video series to revisit some Old Testament stories to show you just how they point us to Jesus. This is really important when it comes to reading the Old Testament, because I think that many of us have been taught to read the Old Testament like you would read Aesop's fables, like they're morality tales. Noah is about trusting in God even when people think you're nuts, or David and Goliath is a story about overcoming the giants in your life. But there's a better way of reading the Old Testament, and that's as a story that points us to Jesus. I want to go back to Genesis. In Genesis 11, we read that faith in God is almost gone, and God comes to a man named Abram, tells him to take some of his family and to leave his homeland and follow God, and that he'll bless him, and through him he'll bless all the people on earth, and that he and his wife Sarai will have a child one day. And so Abram and his wife Sarai set out with their relatives, but after many years, Abram is 80 years old, and still Sarai has no child. In Genesis 15, God visits Abram in a vision, and he reminds him that he will provide him with a child, and he will give him the promised land. But Abram asks God how he knows this will happen, since he still has no child, and 80-year-olds do not easily take over foreign lands. In response, in verse 9, God tells Abram to bring him a few animals and to cut them in half and lay them on the ground with a path in between. What's going on here is that they are making a covenant with each other. In those days, two people would cut one or more animals in half, and they'd lay them on the ground, and then each party would walk through the middle of the pieces as if to say, "If I do not follow through on my part of the covenant, may I become like these pieces." And so Abram does as God says. And in verse 17, we read this: "When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, 'To your descendants I will give this land.'" What is going on here? Abraham is unsure of two things. He's unsure that God is going to fulfill his promise of a child, and he's unsure that he has what it takes to enter the promised land. And how does God respond? He has Abram set up a covenant. Now, typically in those days, if a king and a servant were setting up a covenant, the servant would walk between the pieces, but the king would not, because after all, he's the king, and he doesn't have to. But what happens in this case? God passes through the pieces in the form of a smoking firepot with a blazing torch, in essence telling Abram, "If I do not come through for you, if you do not have a child of promise and inherit this land, may I die, be cut up as these animals are." But that's not all that happens. Notice who does not pass through the pieces: Abram. In essence, God is also saying, if you fail to come through, I will pay the penalty for that as well. Right here in Genesis 15, we hear echoes of the gospel. We see a glimpse of Jesus. God tells Abram that he always keeps his promises, and that if he doesn't, he promises to die. But he also tells Abram that if Abram does not come through on his promises, that God will take the punishment that he deserves. And this is the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. As it says in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, "He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed." And as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15:3, he says that the gospel in a nutshell is this: Jesus Christ died for our sins. This is great news for all of us who know that we can't measure up to God's standards, who know that we don't always keep our promises. In Jesus, God has taken the penalty that we deserved, died the death that we should have died, so that our sins are forgiven and we are made right with God. In Genesis 15, we read that Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Abram is made right with God not by his deeds, not by his good works, but by trusting in God's promise. God will never fail us. And even if we fail God, He has taken the penalty that we deserved in Jesus' death for us on the cross. That is what Genesis 15 is all about.